Access, May 10, 2024. Disability Inclusion in Computer Science. Dr. Brianna Blaser.
Thanks so much for having me here. I'm excited to be here. My name is Brianna Blaser. I use she, her pronouns. I am a white cisgendered woman who's middle-aged, and behind me is a bunch of artwork from my kids. So excellent. So I'm going to talk a little bit about disability inclusion in computer science. I spend most of my time working on thinking about accessibility and disability in STEM, or computing, education and careers through the Access Computing Alliance, which is one of the National Science Foundation funded broadening participation in computing alliances. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we do and then things that I see that we're engaged in access computing, but also that other folks interested in these topics are engaged in the computer science community that are potentially of interest to other STEM fields as well. So we've done some work around collecting disability related data in broadening participation work. There's a lot of work about having accessibility chairs for conferences to ensure conferences are accessible, thinking about teaching about accessibility in computing courses so that the next generation of engineers is knowledgeable and can design accessible products. And then also thinking about K-12 programming tools and the accessibility of them. So that's, I think I left an old bullet point on there. So Access Computing, we are one of these, again, broadening participation in computing alliances. They work nationwide. There are about 13 of them funded by the National Science Foundation. We've been funded since 2006. Just this last month or so, our founding PI, Richard Ladner, who is here at the University of Washington with me, has retired, and we have a new PI, Maya Kaknak. So our goal is increasing the participation of people with disabilities in computing, education, and careers nationwide through two strategies. One is direct interventions with people with disabilities. So we have a mentoring community of students with disabilities from across the country, all the way from community college, undergraduate, to master's and PhD students pursuing computing fields that have disabilities. Since 2006, we've worked with about 1,400 different students, bringing them through that career path and helping them transition into careers. We do mentoring and career development activities with them, webinars, we send them to conferences, and do undergraduate research. So that piece is working directly with folks with disabilities, but we are also thinking about institutional transformation. So how do we help ensure that computing departments and organizations are welcoming and accessible to people with disabilities? So we work with a network of partners. We have about just over 100 partners nationwide, who are working to think about how do they make their departments better? How can they improve their organizations? So we meet with them on a regular basis. We share resources with them. They can apply for mini grants for funding to enact things at their universities. And one of the most common things that we do is field questions of like, oh, I have a student with a disability in my class. I don't know what to do. How do I handle this? And help give them that feedback to make sure that what they're doing is working. Similarly, we work with computing organizations who might say, we're trying to work to make this event more accessible. What are some strategies we can use? And we'll sit through and talk through the event and do consulting with them on that. So we have leadership here at the University of Washington. We also have co-PIs at Gallaudet, Tufts, and University of California, Irvine. And I'll also just mention, if you want to join our community of practice and receive weekly emails related to things that are going on in disability and accessibility in STEM, education and employment, you can shoot me an email. My email is blaser, BLASER, @uw.edu. And I can get you added to that. So if you're interested in looking for more resources on that, we have tons of resources, webinars, and videos, and written publications on our website related to these topics as well. And our website is uw.edu/accesscomputing. Excellent. So what are we thinking about as an organization when we're thinking about influencing computing disciplines as a national resource? Part of this is very much that accessibility is not an afterthought, right? We need to think about designing things to be accessible from the beginning. And within our organizations, we need to think beyond just being compliance focused, right? So often when I'm out talking to folks about disability on their campuses, they say, oh, yeah, we have a disability resources office on campus. They handle that. Well, often those folks are handling accommodations and, again, that compliance piece of it, but they aren't thinking about the justice and equity piece quite as well. That isn't necessarily their mandate. So thinking about that piece of it. I think I talked about a lot of this, providing resources and individualized consulting, right? And I think we have seen change over time in other broadening participation in computing alliances, BPC organizations, as we call them, related to accessibility. They're much more interested and much more engaged. But this has been advocacy that's happened over a prolonged period, right? So we're almost 20 years old now. And over that time, we've seen an impact. We may not have seen an impact in the past few years. Just yesterday, I was talking to a former program officer of ours, and she was talking about when NSF envisioned the BPC Alliance program, that was part of their thinking, that this is not change that's going to happen in a short period of time, but something that would happen over a much longer period. And of course, there are questions of how long should that continue to go on. So I said I would talk a little bit about collecting disability-related data. And why? My first question when I got to this work was, where is the data? So my background was in working with women in STEM fields. And so when I got here, I was like, well, great, let me just dig into the research base, and very quickly discovered, oh, we know a lot less about people with disabilities in STEM education and careers than we do about women. And when you look, there isn't necessarily that much disability data. Departments aren't collecting it. Very early on in coming to Access Computing, I started working with Access Computing in 2011. We started asking our partners, well, can you get data from your organization, or from your institution? So these are computing departments. Can you get data about the number of students with disabilities in your department? And can we track that over time to see if there's a change in the time that you're working with us? And most of them could not get the data. Their universities wouldn't give it to them. They claimed they didn't track it. You know, even when we talked to other organizations who were maybe doing a survey, maybe a climate survey of their department, we would say, well, can you collect disability-related data? And we would get all kinds of questions about how to do it, or we would get, oh, well, that's illegal. We can't actually do that. We did also get questions from people of like, I want to ask if people have a disability, but what's the right language to use, right? And trying to encourage them to avoid using euphemisms like special needs or those other things that make most folks in the disability community cringe. So we're often kind of sharing language when folks were interested. And then the other thing that we started to notice was that there were inconsistent approaches to asking questions about disability. So as a matter of fact, if you look at the survey of earned doctorates and you look at it longitudinally, you'll see that there are a couple times when the percentage of people with disabilities jumps. And it jumps not because of necessarily any underlying change in the population who are earning doctorates, but it's changing each of those times because they changed the question that they were asking to determine whether somebody had a disability or not. And so we have to think about this and how we're asking a question and be consistent about it. And so in 2020, my colleague Richard Ladner and I published this paper at Respect, the Conference for Research on Equitable and Sustained Participation in Engineering, Computing, and Technology. Why is data on disability so hard to collect and understand, right? So we kind of outlined like, here are the reasons you should be collecting these data. Here are all of the excuses that we've heard for why people won't even ask the question. Those are not good reasons. Here's some ways that you can think about collecting disability data. And I think once we published this, it gave people a best practice to follow, and it made it much easier for folks to institute asking about disability data in whatever context they might be collecting demographic information. And I can, when I'm done talking, I can drop a link to that paper in the chat. So, you know, I might change this language if we were to do it today, but the language we laid out then was, do you identify as having a disability or other chronic condition? Yes, no, prefer not to disclose. How would you describe your disability or chronic condition? Attention deficit, autism, blind or low vision, deaf or hard of hearing, health-related disability, learning disability, mental health condition, mobility-related disability, speech-related disability, and other. And so, again, we laid this out, and after we laid it out, some folks started adopting it, right? So we have seen organizations take that up and use it when they are collecting other demographic data, which is exactly what we wanted to see. Also, again, through continually talking to folks and encouraging them to collect data, we have slowly seen change. So there's the covers of 3 different reports on the screen at the moment. One is the 2022 State of Computer Science Education Report. This is put out by Code.org, the Computer Science Teachers Association, and another one of these BPC alliances called Expanding Computing Education Pathways. And for years, we would say every year, oh, there's no data on disability in here. There's no data on disability in here. We really wish you could report on this, right? Can you ask states if they have this data? And so 2022 was the first year that they got that data on disability in there, and specifically told us, thank you for pushing us on this. Since then, they've had more data each year from states on the number of students with disabilities that are taking K-12 computer science classes, which interestingly differs significantly state to state, largely because the proportion of students under IDEA or 504 that are being served in different states vary. And I have some theories about how that might be related to things like diagnosis. I probably got to speed up my time. The TALB survey, which is conducted by the Computing Research Association, again, after years of advocacy, they started collecting data. And the Computer Science Teachers Association did a landscape survey of K-12 teachers with computer science, or K-12 computer science teachers, and we got them to collect that data as well. We've also seen other organizations take this up. The other thing that we're seeing more and more about is conference accessibility chairs just being part of how we put together a computing conference. So designating somebody to explicitly think about accessibility in the context of a conference. It's really well described in the ACM SIG Access, which is the special interest group for accessibility, Accessible Conference Guide. And again, if you Google SIG Access Accessible Conference Guide, this document will come up. It's been revised several times. They also have a corresponding virtual conference guide that really walks somebody through what do you need to do to ensure that a conference is accessible, and they outline what an accessibility chair might be. So again, this is increasingly common in computing conferences, particularly those that have to do with broadening participation and human-computer interaction conferences. I think this has become more common following some memorable conferences with accessibility issues. So SIGCHI, SIGCHI, is the major human-computer interaction conference. A number of years back, it was held in Scotland, and there was a protest or a sit-in of some sort. I was not there, but heard from my colleagues who participated because of how inaccessible the venue was to people with disabilities, right? So again, this is something that we're seeing across fields. What are accessibility chairs doing? They're ensuring access both through accommodations and universal design strategies. I've served as accessibility chair for the Tapia Celebration of Diversity in Computing, as well as the Respect Conference that I mentioned earlier. And a lot of times I am sitting in meetings, talking to the folks who are handling logistics, being a fly on the wall, trying to figure out where folks can take and use strategies to make conferences more accessible, right? So thinking about things like the location, the venue, the website, the submission and review process, is that accessible? If you're having published papers, are those going to be made accessible? Presentation guidelines, meals and social events. So really every part about the conference. And some of it is very low hanging fruit. So often when I talk to people in my community that have disabilities about asking about accommodations when they attend a conference, they will request accommodations and then they don't hear anything. And so then they're showing up to an event, not knowing whether their needs are going to be met, or not knowing how they're going to go find the sign language interpreter or the cited guide that they might need to navigate the space, right? And so even just thinking as something as simple as having a person who is designated to reply to accessibility requests and knows how to help meet those needs. So there's, again, this accessible conference guide put out by SIG Access, which has great resources on it. We've published a guideline on accessible online meetings and events. We published that early 2020 when it became apparent that a number of people were transitioning to doing things online and didn't have experience with that. And since we've been doing it for quite a while with a large disability community, we had some best practices to recommend. And then there's another group, Access SIGCHI. Again, this is out of the human-computer interaction community and focused on how to make that particular community more accessible. And they've developed a number of accessibility chair resources, as well as a mailing list and a training to help ensure that folks who are not accessibility experts can step into this role and help make conferences more accessible. And I think I just took it for granted that this was something that I was seeing on a day-to-day basis. And then last year, I was sitting in some of the planning committees for the National Academy's Beyond Compliance workshop series on disability and accessibility in STEM. And I just mentioned, well, accessibility chairs for conferences. And it was an interdisciplinary group that I was sitting in, and folks said, no, that's not common. I don't see that. And I said, oh, that is something we see. That's something other folks can learn for what we are doing in computing fields. So some of the things we're seeing are like providing attendees with accessibility information on the conference website, again, so you know what you're getting into before you get there. Providing speakers with accessible presentation guidelines, which SciAccess also did a great job of helping ensure that speakers knew how to make their presentations accessible. Asking about accessibility as part of a conference evaluation. Are you actually getting feedback from the people with disabilities that are attending to know what you can do to make it better? A big thing in person has been advocating for consistent microphone usage. Once you start doing that and say, no, we're not just going to all say we have loud teacher voices, we're going to use the microphones, it becomes part of the cultural expectations. We're also seeing more and more folks proactively captioning plenary sessions at conferences. It'd be great to see it more, but again, there's the cost involved in that. Excellent. So that was the second strategy I said I would talk about. The third is teaching about accessibility in computing courses. I like to point out that oftentimes people get these confused. So in this context, I'm not talking about teaching accessibly, in other words, teaching so that students with disabilities have their needs met, but rather teaching about accessibility and how to make technology accessible. If we go back about 10 years, I think that we had a lot of speculation that accessibility information might appeal to diverse students, including students with disabilities who either bring accessibility knowledge or might be inherently interested in it. There was also research out that shows, for example, that women are really interested in learning about ways that STEM can be used to improve the world around them. This was a clear connection to that. So maybe this would really interest a lot of folks. But it wasn't necessarily something that was commonly being taught in computing courses. So about 2018, some colleagues of mine published this paper, Who Teaches Accessibility? It was a survey of US computing faculty members. They used technology to scrape email addresses of computing faculty from computing departments across the country. And they found that about 20% of computing faculty were teaching about accessibility in their courses, which that's fairly sizable. It was happening primarily in human-computer interaction courses. There's maybe some reasons behind that, thinking about the humans behind the technology has that tie into accessibility. But it's not necessarily being taught often. It's not necessarily being taught in core classes. It may be a standalone course. And then when we ask faculty, well, why aren't you teaching about this if this is something that you're not talking about in terms of how to design technology that's accessible? They often said, well, I don't know myself, and there's a lack of resources about how I'm going to teach about accessibility in my courses. So that came out in 2018. It's kind of encouraged folks to think about sharing and building resources related to teaching accessibility. At about the same time, there was this organization, Teach Access, formed. It was formed by companies who are interested in designing more accessible products. And they specifically wanted to engage with post-secondary computing departments because they wanted to be able to hire more engineers who could build accessible technology. And they were finding that they couldn't find folks who could do that. So they wanted to make sure that they had in their staff, both folks who had a low level knowledge of accessibility and knew like, hey, we got to think about accessibility here, as well as folks that had much higher levels of expertise and could make all of those design decisions. But again, they couldn't find those folks because it's not being taught often enough. And so they have been working to encourage computing departments to teach about accessibility within computing classes, but then also talking to companies about how are you talking about accessibility in job ads and showing that it's something you prioritize as a company so that engineers are incentivized to learn because they see that companies want these skills. I talked a little bit about Teach Access already. So they have resources for students to go learn from companies and others who are in accessibility, and again, for faculty and employers as well. And just last month, well, I guess it's 2 months ago now, it's May, in March, some colleagues of mine released a textbook, an online textbook teaching accessible computing, which is designed to have chapters that can be slotted into what would be core computing courses. So maybe you're teaching computer vision, maybe you're teaching robotics. How could you talk about accessibility and disability within the context of those courses? So it's designed to give instructors enough information to include some information in their courses without having to be an accessibility expert. So again, that's just come out. We're excited to see, hopefully folks take that up and see the impact that that might have. And then finally, I wanted to talk about accessibility of K-12 programming tools. So in the last decade, there has been an explosion of computer science in K-12 courses, thanks to organizations like code.org and efforts from across the country. The National Science Foundation has funded a lot of this as well. And I think really kind of emblematic of how accessibility was included in this like explosion. In 2016, AP Computer Science Principles launches. This is, there had been the old computer science A/B exam, but this was really designed to be a course that would not necessarily just focused on computing, but focused on, on programming, but focused more on computing technology and be a little bit more broad. There were a number of approved curriculum when it launched. Not a single one was accessible. If you had a blind student, they weren't going to be able to take the class. End of story. So where do we go from there, right? Like that's a pretty sad reality. Most of these programming environments are using blocks-based programming. So on the screen, you'll see a screenshot of the Scratch programming language. The way these block-based programs work, you often are drag and dropping blocks that have what would have been a programming command you would have typed out before. And they fit together and it helps you figure out the structure of your program. There's good evidence that this is a good introduction for folks who've never programmed before to learn about programming. They are largely inaccessible until just within the last year. None of them were accessible to screen reader users. Many of them had problems for folks who were not mouse users as well. So if you couldn't do that drag and drop, you weren't going to be programming in these languages. Then most of them have purely visual output. So even if that blind student has somebody helping them and they design their little sprite, which is what this little dinosaur guy is, and he does some action or animation, it's probably not going to be visible to the blind person. So it's not very helpful, right? What does this mean about who can participate in computer science? And there's really been I point to the Quorum programming language, which was designed by a friend of mine, Andreas Stefik, at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. He does evidence-based studies to figure out what are going to be the best commands to do something. It is used extensively in schools for the blind. So he was the one who solved this problem about computer science principles, worked with code.org to develop a version that was accessible, that used Quorum instead of the things that they had embedded in their curriculum that were inaccessible. He now has just in the last year developed an accessible version of blocks because there's so much demand from folks who are training in-service and pre-service teachers to use these block-based programming languages. There's games, there's data science, there's all kinds of things. So he's building this tool to ensure that accessible programming exists. And there's been increased demand from school districts to find accessible products. There was a new law in Maryland. Maryland's my home state, so I get a little happy every time that I see this. But they have a new requirement that introduces an accessibility requirement into the procurement process for digital educational tools in K-12 schools. Now, they should have been accessible anyway based on pre-existing legislation, but this one had a little bit more teeth. There were fines involved in it. And it meant Maryland all of a sudden went out and said, oh my gosh, we have got to find accessible products for our schools who are teaching computer science. And so we've been working with them a lot and seen them pop up in some of these accessibility related conversations in a new way as a result of this law. I think we are also excited right now. Andy Stefik and I were talking this week about the new DOJ Title II rules and how that might influence the choice of programming environments in K-12 settings nationwide. So we'll see what the rest of that story is shortly. So I'm going to stop talking there. Again, we have lots of resources. I am happy to talk to folks more. And so again, our URL for more information, uw.edu/accesscomputing. And my email address is Blaser, BLASER @uw.edu. So I will stop the share there.
Thank you so much for that talk, Dr. Blaser. I personally, as part of my work with SciAccess, have experienced the struggle of trying to find consistent disability statistics, especially in regards to working in the field of STEM, in which finding statistics is even more difficult. So personally, I wanted to ask the question of whether your team has compiled disability statistics into a resource at all, if any of the papers you have worked on has involved compiling any of those resources or digging into where certain statistics come from.
There's a little bit of that in that Respect 2020 paper, which Lizette, thank you for putting that link in the chat for me. There's a little bit of that there, but we haven't done it more systematically other than saying, here are some estimates that exist. These numbers are hard to count. And I think there are reasons for that. I think even if you try and look at who has a disability and who doesn't, you know, I know a lot of folks that struggle with whether they're going to claim a disability or not. And then you can look at the questions that are used by the US Census. So these are the ones that are asking about functional limitations that, you know, how well are you able to see? How well are you able to walk? And those questions will get some folks who won't say, well, I have a disability, right? I think about my own mother. She's had 6 joint replacements, and she has, you know, an accessibility parking placard. And for a number of years, you could have said to her, do you have a disability? And she would have said no, right? But those questions would have caught it because she knows that she has difficulty walking. At the same time, if you look at those questions, they're not going to catch folks who are neurodivergent necessarily. They're not necessarily going to catch folks who have chronic health or mental health conditions. And so there's a tension there about, I don't, you know, how many different functional limitations can we ask about to really identify who actually has a disability? What does it mean to identify as having a disability? You know, I don't even know. And, you know, in that paper, we talked too about, well, at the K-12 level, let's just look at the students who have IEPs and 504 plans. And, you know, okay, that's necessarily undercounting as well. So I don't know that there's like a perfect answer other than like, we've got to do something. And we've got to point out that this data is hard to figure out in terms of who's reporting and what's being reported.
Is there a certain resource that you recommend above another? I know that there's large surveys such as pulling directly from the census, pulling from the CDC. It seems like all disability articles kind of choose a side depending on how they want to define disability. Do you and your colleagues tend to decide one way or another which methodology is, I'm not sure if better is really something we can even define, but is it better to try to move away from either are you disabled, yes, no, into those more qualitative questions?
I think my first response to that is I'm hesitant of the functional limitation question. So the reason for this is if you dig into the survey of earned doctorates, when they move to those questions, the percentage of people who were being identified as having a vision-related disability was much, much higher than what we would see in the general population. And I don't think that's because there's a lot of blind and low vision people going and getting doctorates. I think that's because people saw that question and said, well, I really need glasses, right? And so that almost seems like a problem with those sorts of questions as well. But again, there are lots of folks that aren't going to identify as having a disability. Some colleagues of mine at the ARC network, which forget what it stands for, but they are funded by the National Science Foundation to think about, to bring together the advanced grants. They have used language, adapted some of the language we used, and then added language about, or is the environment disabling you, kind of getting at that idea of the social model, which I think is interesting as well. I kind of think this is an evolving problem. And I don't have the best answer other than here's what we've been doing and what we've been getting folks to do in computing in order to just be consistent across the field.
That is really fascinating. Thank you so much. We have one more question that we can get to from Raquel saying, so many great nuggets of information here. Thank you for the resources. You mentioned that in terms of surveying and inquiring about persons with disabilities, so you've updated some elements today. Can you share what types of things you would approach differently now?
I think I've mentioned two of them. Well, one is when we published that, we said blind or visually impaired, and I have switched that and I switched it on the slide to blind and low vision. I'm trying to avoid impairment language. Although I do still see that quite a bit in the literature. The other thing is again, this piece over K-12. And I think at the time we were naive about the extent to which we could rely upon who was getting services in K-12 and the extent to which students, particularly from low socioeconomic statuses, would be less likely to be identified by their school districts as having a disability. So that I would change too, but that is one piece of information. And I could go on about how institutional data is not always the best to go, but I will stop there. And thank you so much.
SciAccess. Learn more at www.sciaccess.org.